Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 240 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Near the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, I spoke with Jay Kim about his book, Analog Church. It was a great conversation that you can go back and listen to. It's episode 131. In his follow-up book, Analog Christian, Jay continues to address how we relate to technology, our devices, and our apps. He talks about how we think we're using our devices, but don't realize that our devices are also using us. I love the wisdom he shares in this book. By the way, Analog Christian was recently given the Gospel Coalition Award of Distinction in Christian Living. Jay Kim serves as the lead pastor at Westgate Church in the Silicon Valley and on the leadership team of the Regeneration Project. His writing has been featured in Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Missio Alliance, and Relevant Magazine. He lives in Silicon Valley with his wife and 2 children. And in addition to Analog Christian, Jay has written Analog Church, 40 Days Through the Book of Colossians, and he's a contributing author to a number of other projects. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, please follow, rate, and review, and be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Jay Kim. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Jay Kim, author of Analog Christian. Jay, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation.
Oh, of course, Alan. Thanks for having me.
It's great to be with you. And, we had a chance to talk early in the pandemic about your earlier book, Analog Church, and I'm really glad to have a chance to talk again about a book that sounds like a partner to that one. Can you share a bit of the journey in writing this book?
Yeah, the follow-up book is called Analog Christian. Analog Church was really a book about the intersection between the digital age and our ecclesiology. It was a book that I was envisioning specifically my friends who serve and shepherd and lead local church congregations. When I wrote that book, when I wrote Analog Christian, I was thinking about our congregation. I was thinking about the men and women who I have the privilege of loving and serving and guiding and shepherding sort of week after week, year after year. I was thinking about the men and women in my small group at church, that meets right here in my office. So it's really a book that's primarily about the intersection of the digital age and just our discipleship to Jesus, our formation, the people we are becoming. So it's really a book for all, whereas the first book was a book specific. I mean, it's for anybody, but it's specifically written to church leaders. And a fascinating thing, when I pitched the book ideas to the publisher, I actually intended to write the second book first. But the publisher suggested, we think that if you can sort of share very directly to church leaders first, that might allow you then to develop thoughts further and then to be able to speak more broadly. So this is a book, really, I share that to say this is a book that's been sort of rustling inside of me for several years now.
Yeah, so it's been there for a while, and I can appreciate sort of the logical order of what you had envisioned, and I kind of appreciate maybe the marketing order that InterVarsity suggested.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, one of the things I sometimes say to leaders is that, our digital devices are wonderful servants, but they're really tyrannical masters.
Yeah.
And one of your powerful sentences, I really appreciated this, that the digital technology we think we're using are in fact using us. Can you say more about that reality?
Yeah, I think the best way to explain it is I think that whole idea, the genesis of it, came from things I had been reading for several years, not from Christian writers initially, but mostly from design ethicists, people in Silicon Valley and all over the world who work in technology generally, but specifically in maybe the social media sphere, or just media, online media in general. And I kept hearing some form or some version of the same refrain, which was essentially, and I think it was originally a man named Tristan Harris who said it. It was essentially some version of the same sort of idea that, nothing is free in the world. And if you think something is free in any sort of interaction or any sort of exchange, then there's a decent chance that you are the product being sold. You are the commodity sort of being exchanged in that particular marketplace. And so this guy, Tristan Harris, who is a design ethicist, I think he was the first one who said it, that, we think social media applications are free, and they are in some way. You go to your app store on your phone or your iPad or whatever, and you download it, and you now have whatever, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever it might be, and it charges you nothing. There's no monetary cost. And so we think it's free. We're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I just get to enter this world. It costs me nothing and I gain everything. But in reality, what Harris and other design ethicists sort of unanimously agree on is it's not free. It's free to us because we are the product. We are the commodity being exchanged. And specifically, it is our attention that is being bought and sold. And so that to say, the more addicted we become to our online lives, the better it is for the bottom line of big tech in particular. But the more detrimental and the more costly, I believe, it is to our humanity, to our souls, and this is kind of your world, Alan, to the invitation of Jesus to go on the slow and steady journey of being formed into Christ likeness. And instead, we acquiesce, we relinquish that call and find ourselves sort of frenetically scrolling the digital landscape. And it is doing something to us. So the question is not, what does digital technology do for us? That's an easy answer. It does all sorts of things, adds all sorts of convenience and comfort, maybe some entertainment, whatever it might be. That's not the primary question. The primary question, especially for followers of Jesus, has to become not what is it doing for us, but how is it forming us? Yeah. And if that formational journey is counter to the sort of person God is calling us to be, then we've got to be mindful of that, and we've got to make some changes.
No, I really agree. Yeah. So, where we may not be spending money, we are spending time, we're spending attention. Yeah. Gosh, it's almost as though we're spending our souls in some ways. And, one of my great concerns about how we use our devices and apps is how they really train us in distraction, which would, of course, be the opposite of attention. I think a lot of us are struggling with the capacity to be attentive because of how our engagement with devices and technologies is training us in that way. Can you say more about that from your perspective?
I couldn't agree more. We are, it's sort of, people say things like, the word unprecedented has become overused now. It's like ad nauseum.
It's very precedented now.
It's very precedented now. But I would say, we are, at minimum, we are distracted in a way that is unique to the rest of human history. We just have, you just think about the physicality of it. We have never had such easy, quick access to literally an endless world of information, entertainment, and outrage and vitriol. We have never had such access before, ever in human history. Yeah. And it has also happened so quickly. You think about the gap in time between, for example, the printing press in, the 16th century, and then how many hundreds of years it took before we had the telegraph in the 19th century. That is maybe four. I'm bad at math. It's 300 to 400 years in between those two giant leaps in technology. Well, now you think about television. Televisions made their way into American homes sort of mid 20th century, 1940s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
We are less than 100 years from that, and televisions are becoming obsolete. Everything is moving to these tablets and phones are getting bigger and bigger. That is less than 100 years. You think about the internet. I remember being a high school student in the late 90s, and my senior year of high school, 1997, that's when we got internet in our home. And it was that strange dial-up, it sounded like a really loud, cranky printer. And it took 3 minutes to log online, and it took another 2 minutes for a single page to load. But I thought it was magic. I can't believe it. I can see all the sports scores right here and the box scores. This is incredible. The game just happened 2 hours ago, and here it is. That was less than a quarter century ago. I mean, we're talking 20 years or so. And now if you walked into your friend's house and you're like, hey, what's the Wi-Fi? And they told you, oh, we use dial-up here. I mean, you would consider not being that person's friend. You'd be like,
you are a Neanderthal. What are you?
Yeah. What sort of caveman are you? Who lives this way? You don't have to live this way, So you just think about the speed, right? And we are now, because of that pace, the pace of growth in terms of technology, and because digital technologies are built on an attention economy, because of how fast it's growing and how quickly and how much more of our attention these technologies are able to harbor, we are living in, these are the words of the writer Cal Newport, we are living in absolute frenetic shallowness. We never linger for a long time in any one place because we don't have to. Any moment of boredom, I can pull out my phone and I can lose myself to a gazillion different options for entertainment or distraction or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of neurological research that is showing, the plasticity of the human mind, the brain. It's a fascinating thing. Essentially, what that means is your brain can get rewired. It doesn't take much to rewire the neurons that fire together, wire together, that whole phrase. Well, you keep firing the neurons that give you those dopamine hits every time you click and swipe and scroll. Soon enough, your brain is going to be wired for that, which means addicted to it. Addicted to distraction. And I think that's the world we live in today. And I would say, we talked a lot about pandemics in the last couple of years. I would say that is really the primary pandemic. It's the pandemic of distraction in some ways, that we cannot linger for any length of time anymore. And that's, you said it earlier, Alan, that is robbing us of our humanity. It's robbing us of our souls.
And as you were rehearsing your experience with technology, I've entered my 60s in the last couple of years. So I can recall a childhood before color television. I can recall a childhood with, turning a knob instead of pushing a button to get channels. So I can think of all of these moments, and I can remember a season as a kid or as a youth where, boredom just was. It was part of the landscape, and you went out and found something to do outside. And, but even with that, having been around for the advent of the personal computer and all those different sort of new developments, still today, now in my 60s, I find those devices they have a siren call for me. They're very easily engaged, and they're very hard to put down. Yeah. It requires, I've had to decide some spiritual practices related to my devices about when I will and when I will not engage them. Right. What are some ways you've sort of maybe thought about that for yourself, or as you give counsel to those you shepherd, about how to manage or how to create helpful boundaries maybe in the engagement with devices?
Yeah. Yeah, the first thing I'll say is high level, sort of 30,000-foot view. One of the things that's been so helpful for me is to consider the reality, the sort of, almost upside down, backwards, ironic, paradoxical reality that liberation is found in limits. Limits are liberation. There have been lots of research studies done that have shown, actually it's happened, Stanford University, which is just up the road from where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
They've done this research study several times over many years where they'll take young children and they'll put them in two different types of playgrounds, one playground with a very clear, distinct boundaries, almost a small fence that says, okay, you can play within this space, but don't go outside of this space. And then they'll take another group of kids and place them on a playground where there is no fence. There are no clear boundaries. It's just a big, wide open field. Kids could go anywhere, do anything. And you would think that the kids who play on the field with no boundaries would roam free and exhibit a sort of exhilarating liberation to go do and explore and do whatever it is they want. But what they've actually discovered many times as they've done this study, almost unanimously every single time, it's the kids who play in the playground, on the playground with clear boundaries that roam free within the limits. And the kids who are plopped on a playground with no clear boundaries, they actually become paralyzed. They just end up playing in sort of one small little geographic area. Because a limitless life is actually enslavement. It's paralysis.
Yeah.
If you don't know where the line is between what is good and not good, what is safe and unsafe, eventually, at first you might just go wild, but eventually it'll paralyze you. Yeah. And so that's the first thing I'll say. Limits are liberation. Liberation is found in limits. And so with that to say, yeah, you paid whatever it is you paid for that smartphone or your laptop or your iPad or whatever. But if you want to leverage it appropriately, if you want to leverage it in a healthy way, in a responsible way, instead of the technology leveraging you, then you've got to put limits. You've got to put limits on it. So, this is getting super practical, nuts and bolts. A couple of things just that I do in my life. I don't have any notifications on my phone. So, yes. My wife and my family, they know if there's an emergency, call me, don't text me. Because I don't get text notifications. I actually have to open my text box to see text messages. I have no, it's not just text. I just have no notifications. Nothing dings on my phone. Yeah. I've deleted basically all social media from my phone. I still have social media. Some of it, I think I would probably delete it all if it weren't for the nature of some of the work that I do. Sure. But I don't have it on my phone. So for me to go on social media, I have to open my laptop, type in the URL, type in my handle, type in my password, log in. I never stay logged in. I have to go through that entire process. What that's done for me is in moments of boredom, I used to find myself just habitually opening social media and scrolling. Well, I can't do that anymore because I don't have it on my phone. Yeah. I've deleted some other apps where I found myself doing that quite a bit as well. So I do have, a news app on my phone. So I will sometimes go there, but at least at that point, I'm catching up on what's happening locally and in the world. And it's not just this mindless, sort of scroll through people's, pictures of food or something. Yeah. So those things have been really helpful for me. And then one other thing that's been helpful for my family, we leave all of our digital technologies in the kitchen. We have sort of a docking station in the kitchen. They never make their way into our bedroom or into our living room, or we spend time as a family, or our dining room. They just kind of lodge in the kitchen. They charge there. We try to put our phones to bed before we go to bed. We try to wake up and spend time without our phones before we wake our phones up. That's been really helpful. So, my phone is not within arm's length on my nightstand. It's in the kitchen, and I can, our bedrooms are sacred places, non-digital spaces where we can just be human with one another. So, yeah, those are some of the things I've done. There's so many others that I think friends of mine have done as well, but that stuff has been really mostly helpful for us.
I appreciate you sort of making that very particular. Some of the initiatives you've taken have also been really helpful to me. I remember the moment where I stopped using my phone as my alarm clock and realized how many different ways it was hooking me first thing in the morning. Because I would just check email real quick.
Yep.
And of course, I would see something that totally got me riled, or, oh no, I got to work on that. And now my entire day is already off the rails. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate too, your language about the gift of limitations. And it sounds like part of what that does is it helps sort of interrupt that autopilot tendency that we sometimes develop in relationship to these things. Yeah. Now, one of the things I enjoyed about your book, you use 3 words to sort of frame it. And those 3 words, and I found them very inviting: contentment, resilience, and wisdom. Talk to us about how these 3 words, contentment, resilience, wisdom, frame a more maybe hopeful or healthy way of life for us.
Yeah, those words came about because, again, this book for me, I had been thinking about it for many years, but especially when, I was kind of right in the early stages of really putting the ideas of the book together when the pandemic hit and shut us down, and we went to a strictly sort of digital life for many months. During that time, I found myself really, really wrestling with discontentment, fragility, and foolishness, utter lack of self-control. And I was just feeling outraged and angry. I mean, all sorts of things. So I had the early ideas for the book early on. But then as I began writing the book, it took on a whole new life because of the season of life we were in, with the pandemic, and just sort of being relegated to my bedroom with all of my conversations mediated over a screen. I'm an introvert. And so early on, I thought, this might actually be kind of nice. I'll just stay home and, not have to be around a lot of people all the time. And, but I very quickly found, 2-3 weeks in, oh my gosh, even for an introvert like me, this is no way to live. This sort of isolation is it is subhuman, in a very, very significant way. And so I started paying attention to that. And what I realized was the pandemic didn't begin discontentment, fragility, and foolishness in me. What it did was it amplified and revealed the discontentment and foolishness and fragility that was already within me, that was already sort of simmering beneath the surface and rearing its ugly head from time to time. The pandemic and the isolation of the pandemic just put it into overdrive. And so I really started paying attention to that. And I started paying attention to it because I knew that wasn't the life God has for me. I knew that the life God has for me is lots of things, but a few of those things I knew that the life God has for me involves contentment, it involves resilience, and it involves wisdom, instead of foolishness. I just knew that. So I began going on that journey. And as is almost always the case, I landed on Galatians 5, where Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And as I studied that text more and more, what I realized was, it's all here. When God, by his Spirit, begins to cultivate fruitfulness in us, when we give ourselves over to the Spirit of God to do the work that only the Spirit of God can do, the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit, man, these are the antidotes to our discontentment, fragility, and foolishness. And they make us content, resilient, and wise, not overnight. It's a lifelong journey, but we begin walking down the paths toward contentment, resilience, and wisdom. And so that's where the idea came from. It was just my own internal sort of wrestling, recognizing the brokenness in myself, and then coming to that joyful realization, the answer is right here. It's the Spirit of God doing his work in me.
I really resonate with what you're sharing and appreciate your honesty about it. I found some of the similar dynamics. It felt like at least, for us in California, the length of the quarantining and the degree to which we were isolated for so long, I would say it had a refining effect, but the refining side of it took a little while. First, it was a revealing effect, realizing something needed refining. And I love too, as you've already mentioned, that the fruit of the Spirit really framed the chapters of the book. And I wonder if you could speak maybe now as a pastor. I've noticed sometimes people see that list of qualities in Galatians 5, and maybe they don't relate to it as something alive and vital the way you just described it. Can you talk about maybe some of the ways we struggle with that list as opposed to maybe how you're trying to offer them as an invitation or a gift?
Yeah, well, I think the first thought that comes to mind is we often forget that these are characteristics of the Spirit's fruit, not my fruit.
Yeah.
And I think, this is sort of bigger than just this one conversation. There is such a dangerous and really tragic misconception, misunderstanding on both sides of the word grace. On one hand, there are so many of us who think that the grace of God, Christians who think that the grace of God, what it means is that God gave me a golden ticket to heaven when I prayed that prayer, when I was baptized or something. And so that means that when I die, I'll go to heaven. And then grace is not active and alive in my life right now. We then live with this sort of misunderstanding. Well, like, I'm sort of here on my own. I got to figure this out. Oh, I'm such a mess. I'm such a failure. Thank God I'm not going to go to hell or something. But as of right now, my real life right now, man, it's a bummer. I just got, I'm just resigned to this sort of sad existence. Well, that's not true. The grace of God is alive, it's active, and it's for you now. It's not just to justify you, it's to sanctify you. Those are the sort of theological terms for it. But the more sort of layman's terms for it, I would say, is like, it's not just to get you into heaven, it's to get heaven into you right now. I think maybe Dallas Willard was the first one to say something along those lines. And we forget that. Jesus spoke in the present tense quite a bit when he talked about the kingdom of heaven arriving. He didn't primarily say, like, after I die and come back to life, and then maybe after I ascend, and then gazillion years from now, or however long, when I return, that's when heaven will come. No, Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of the heavens, or the kingdom of God as a present reality. Accessible and available right now. And I think the grace of God makes it available to us right now. You can have the heaven, the heavenly life right now. There is enough grace for you to experience heaven in the here and now. And then on the other side of it, dangerously, sometimes we misunderstand grace as a sort of golden ticket into heaven, meaning it requires nothing else of me. I just kind of do my thing and I'm on my way and I can live my life. I do me and you do you, kind of thing. And then when I die, I'll go to heaven and we're all good. But this for sure is Dallas Willard. Willard says grace is opposed to earning. It is not opposed to effort. In other words, when we have truly experienced the grace of God, like truly experienced it, how inequitable it is, how undeserved it is, it brings us to our knees and we realize, oh, this demands something of me. I think of that movie, Saving Private Ryan. It's very common sort of imagery. I'm giving the movie away, so if no one's seen it, I'm sorry.
Spoiler alert, here it is.
Spoiler alert. These troops go on this dangerous, basically suicide mission to rescue a soldier, rescue a young man that they do not know. So they don't know if he's a good man or a terrible man. They don't know if he deserves this sort of sacrifice or not, but it doesn't matter. They go on the journey and it does end up being a sacrifice. Several of these men give their lives to rescue Private Ryan. And then there's that, iconic line at the end. Tom Hanks's character, who is leading these troops, he's shot. So he essentially gives his life to rescue Private Ryan. And as he's dying from his gunshot wound, he whispers to Private Ryan, earn this, earn this. Now, Grace would never say earn this. And in fact, in that movie, I think what Tom Hanks is saying is not possible. There's nothing Private Ryan could do to earn, to make it equitable, that several men gave their lives so that he could live. There's nothing he could do to earn that. Nothing. Yeah. But what it does demand is that he lives a good life, a life that honors the sacrifice. And that's going to require effort from him. That's going to require participation. And I think that's a part of what grace looks like. It looks like saying, I could never earn this, but because this incredible gift has been given to me, man, it demands that I participate with the Spirit of God to do my absolute best to daily conform to his likeness so that he might cultivate his fruit in me, which leads to a life of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, which are the antidotes to so much that ails us in the digital age.
That's so well said. One of my mentors liked to define grace as simply God's empowering presence. So there was a relational reality to that. And that, that sense of, therefore the fruit of the Spirit is, this is who God is. This is the sort of God we follow, we worship. And one of the things I kind of caught in throughout your writing, I've often said that, the fruit of the Spirit flourish far more in an unhurried life than they do in a frenetic life. I'd love to maybe hear a little bit about any of your experience with that dynamic.
Yeah, it is the fruit of the Spirit. It's not the TV dinner of the Spirit. So you can't microwave an orange. You know what I mean? Right. I remember a couple of years ago, I think I tell this story in the book. My daughter, who is 7 now, I think she was 5 at the time, something like that. She went to a vacation Bible school, vacation Bible camp or something at our church. And one of the lessons was about the fruit of the Spirit. And they gave them all these little potted plants, but it was really like a small, tiny little pot with a seed inside. And they said, man, this is how it works. So take it home, show it to your mom and dad, show them the Bible verse, and then put it on a windowsill. Make sure you water it every day. And you're going to begin to see, the little leaves begin to sprout. So she brought this little essentially a tiny little pot of dirt. And she was so excited. And we put it on the windowsill. We poured some water in, make sure it got some sunlight. And I remember literally the very next morning, she walked out and she's staring at it. She's like, Daddy, what? There's nothing. I'm like, well, honey, it takes a little bit longer. We just gotta sort of pour the water so she does it the second day. And by day 3 or 4, she's like, are you kidding me? They lied to me. There's nothing in here. And she was done, she was just, and she's 4 or 5 at the time. So understandable. 24 hours to her is like a year or something. But right. I think so often we are that way. We expect the Spirit of God to microwave transformation in us. We push a few buttons, we say a couple prayers, we read a couple verses, we go to church a couple times, and voila, we should have a transformed life, health and wealth and goodness and everything, Yeah. And that is almost never the case. And I think sadly, tragically, so many of us sort of give up on the journey too soon because it is the fruit of the Spirit. And what did Jesus say in the Gospel of John? Well, as long as you remain in me, the old English word there is abide in me. And what is abiding other than the slow and steady sort of staying in place, staying with for the long haul? Abide in me, remain in me, and then you will bear fruit. I am the vine, you're just branches. Mm-hmm. And if you get cut off from me, if you get impatient, you're like, I'm done, there's no fruit coming, you cut yourself off and move on, The guarantee there is you will not bear fruit. You've got to stay. You got to remain for the long haul. You think about, we have a small orange tree in our front yard. It's not like I walk out there every morning and there are these plump, ripe, beautiful oranges every single morning. They come in seasons.
That's right.
And it takes a lot of sunlight, a lot of rain, a lot of water, and many months for us to get a few oranges. But those oranges are sweet and they're good for you. There's just nothing like it. It's different than a TV dinner. So, again, this kind of leans into so much of your work, Alan, the slow and steady process, the sort of unhurried patience required to go on that journey with the Spirit of God so that he might do his slow and steady work in us. It's so vitally important. And it is so incredibly challenging in a world that is as fast-paced, progress-oriented, and frenzied and hurried as the world we inhabit today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I appreciate your thoughts in that way. Well, I would love to talk about all of the chapters and each of the fruit of the Spirit. I think that's more than we have time for, but I would like to touch a couple. And one of them, you talked about joy. And I loved that you contrasted it with our tendency to live by comparison with others. That seems to me to be a really helpful way to sort of nuance what joy might be for us. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, there was a British psychologist named Michael Asink who I think in the 90s, he coined, I think he was the first one to coin it, I'm not sure, but I think he coined the phrase, the hedonic treadmill. And he's not a Christian. And he basically, hedonic, meaning hedonism, pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure. And so hedonic treadmill, by that, what he meant was most people, his idea is that most people in the modern or late modern Western world, we live our lives on a hedonic treadmill. In other words, we live our lives chasing pleasure, chasing the stuff that feels good, but it's a treadmill. And what is a treadmill? You are constantly moving, but never arriving. You're running and running and running, or chasing and chasing and chasing. And yet you never make actual physical progress. And treadmills are great for working out, but that is no way to live a life. That's no way to go on a journey. And he called it a hedonic treadmill because that is how pleasure works. Pleasure is sort of chasing after bubbles, they're fleeting and they're really, really elusive. They're mesmerizing. You want it, but the moment you reach out and you got it in your hand, it bursts. And then you got to go off chasing another pleasure. And I think so many of us in the modern world, we equate pleasure with joy. In other words, we think if I could just feel good, if I could just have the thing, the house or the job or the money or the relationship or the life that everybody else seems to have on Instagram, then I too will be happy like them. I too will feel joy like them. When in reality, biblically speaking, joy is not that. Joy is pervasive. It is the bedrock upon which we can build our lives. Joy is strong enough to withstand suffering and hardship and pain. We read in Hebrews that Jesus goes to the cross, the cross set before him with joy. He does it for the joy before him, which makes no sense if joy is pleasure. There's nothing pleasurable about dying on a cross. It makes no sense if joy is happiness. That is not a happy moment in Jesus' life. In fact, in Gethsemane, what does he say? He's like, paraphrasing here, Father God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Can we do it another way? Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to do it. It's not happy. It's not pleasurable.
Right.
But there's joy. We think about Paul's words, I have learned to be content in all circumstances. He writes that in his letter to the Philippians, which was written while he was under house arrest. He was imprisoned, in chains, literally in chains. He writes, I'm content because I've learned to be content no matter the circumstances. That's joy.
Yeah.
Joy is not contingent upon circumstances or situations. It's deeper than that. And I think comparison, there's so many things, but I think comparison is one of the main things killing our joy. It's crushing our joy. And we don't have to live that way. Joy is available and possible no matter where you are and what you're going through.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think of the biblical language, same letter. You mentioned Paul's letter to the Philippians. He used that simple little phrase, rejoice in the
Yes.
Lord. There is a rejoice in reality to joy. And we tend to think of it as rejoice about. It's something out there. Yeah. Maybe I don't even have it yet. I got to go find it. I'm exporting my joy. I'm exporting my sense of well-being, or just that inner soul energy that joy is. And as you said, joy works when things suck.
Yeah. Yes.
Happiness, not so much.
Right.
And that's one of the wonderful tests of joy is when you run through a really hard season of life, whether it's outward or inward. Joy still working tells you that it's joy.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Well, in another chapter, you help us by contrasting the fruit of gentleness with our common cultural tendency to be overwhelmed by our own outrage. And you even hinted at that as part of your pandemic experience, that there's so much outrage. And there are those who seem to think that outrage is the only option they have in the face of wrongs that they're witnessing. And there are wrongs, but it doesn't seem to be helping them. And it doesn't seem to be helping the situation much. Can you say more about how gentleness might actually be a transformative invitation?
Yeah. It's interesting. When we hear the word gentleness today, I don't know if this is totally true, but at least for me, I think about babies, like, oh, sweet little babies. And babies are not always gentle, obviously, but in those moments of sweetness, maybe when they're sleeping in your arms, a newborn sort of being held closely, it's like, oh man, so gentle, and it's interesting though, because of that, on the surface, we think of gentleness as a virtue. But when you think about the pace of life for most people, rarely is gentleness functionally upheld as a virtue. Yeah. Susan Cain wrote that book several years ago called Quiet that became a New York Times bestseller. Yeah. It was like about the power of introverts, and specifically it was about the power of those who are quiet, who maybe, and sometimes that comes across to some as gentleness or something. But think about that. She had to write a book that went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list because those who, at least maybe they're not actually gentle, but at least externally embody a sort of gentleness, go feeling totally unheard. And unseen in boardrooms and in workplaces and in schools and churches. And it's really interesting. We hear the word gentleness and think positive thoughts, but functionally in our lives, we don't uphold gentleness. We don't lean into the gentle. We are always, our attention is always grabbed by the loudest, the most outraged. I mean, on social media in particular, what the algorithms have revealed is that outrage sells.
Yeah.
Outrage holds our attention. That's why so many social media companies highlight outrage and vitriol, because it keeps us clicking. It keeps us sharing. It keeps us swiping. And there's a real problem there, because gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. And gentleness is not weakness. No. In fact, in some ways, in a world of outrage, I would suggest gentleness is one of the most resilient and one of the most courageous and confident things you can be. In a world where everybody is screaming and yelling at each other, absolutely pummeling one another online, to be gentle is to cut through the noise of outrage, the chaos of outrage, to settle the storms, as Jesus did, to walk on that choppy water. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do, but it is the calling on the Christian's life to exude the sort of gentleness that Christ exuded. And without that, we just get sucked into the outrage machine. And at that point, you're actually truly unheard at that point. You've now just become noise in the vortex. So gentleness really is, counterintuitively so, the way to be heard in a world of outrage.
I think that's so well said. Jesus opts to use a couple of words to describe himself when he says that he is gentle and humble of heart. And we're having a conversation about him 2,000 years later.
Yes.
Maybe gentle and humble in heart really does have a lasting impact, not just 2,000 years ago in the life of Christ lived, but in our own experience. And I would agree with you. I find when I respond to people with humble, gentle, with that kind of posture, I can listen to what's on their heart. They don't feel they have to yell at me to communicate what they're concerned about. And I can also share what's on my heart. Outrage is just two people yelling past each other, I think, most of the time.
Right.
Well,
absolutely.
I so appreciate this book you've written. I wonder if you could just let our listeners know, how can they find out more about your books and about your work?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Well, I appreciate you and all your work, and I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you. My books are just wherever books are sold, Amazon or whatever else. Analog Church was the first book. Analog Christian is this newer book. And then I have a little website, jkimthinks.com, and most of my work is there, and my email's there. If you want to connect about anything, be happy to chat as well.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. And I wonder if I could ask, if you would, just maybe from your own pastoral heart, just to share a word of closing encouragement to our listeners, maybe very much in the spirit of what you've written, maybe just an invitation.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I would just say to you, those of you who are listening, wherever you are, whatever you are going through, whatever you've done or whatever has been done to you, whatever anxiety or uncertainty or fear you have about the future, or shame or guilt you might have about the past, there is more than enough grace for you. Mm-hmm. And it's not a grace you need to reach out for and grab. It's a grace that's already been given. And the only thing necessary are open hands and open hearts to receive. But to receive it means to say yes to an invitation to live a life that is now conformed to the God who gives that grace to you. But take heart in that invitation, because to live that life of formation into Christ-likeness, the with God life, man, that is life and life to the full, as Jesus says in John 10:10, life and life to the full, not just in eternity, certainly then, but life and life to the full here and now. Heaven is not, like we said, heaven is not a place simply where you will go, although it is that. Heaven is a reality you can live here and now, today. So be encouraged by that. Take heart and take hope in that, and live with open hands and open hearts to receive.
Those are good words. I sure appreciate it. And again, today, our guest has been Jay Kim, and we've been talking about his book, Analog Christian. As always, it's been a pleasure to talk with you today, Jay.
Thanks so much, Alan.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Kelly Kapic, Roger Parrott, and Richard Foster. We'll also have a conversation with one of the founders of Aro, a company that's developed an exciting tool to help us relate better to our smartphones. I can't wait to share those episodes with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.